Hello and welcome to a York and District Branch lecture. This lecture was originally due to be broadcast on Tuesday the 18th of January, but unfortunately due to a technical difficulty we weren't able to broadcast it that evening. So thank you for watching it now. We really appreciate your attention and hope you find the lecture interesting. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Francis Cleaver, who's Professor of Political Ecology at the University of Lancaster. Francis was previously at the University of Sheffield, and I recently heard from somebody there who says they're missing her greatly at Sheffield. So Francis, a very warm welcome this evening, and thank you for taking the trouble to give us this lecture.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Hello everybody. I can't see you because you're not actually there at the moment, but anyway, I'm very glad to have you as an audience. I'm going to talk about something based on a research project I'm currently doing on transformations to groundwater sustainability. But I'm going to use this to think about some of the global policies about water governance and how that actually works out in terms of local practices. Okay, so the presentation's in two sorts of parts. I'll say something generally about global policies and the global consensus on water governance. And then I'll talk a little bit about what other things we might want to look at if we're considering how water interactions work out for local people. So we all know, water is really essential to life and livelihoods. It's essential for growing food, for drinking, washing, cleaning, cooking, for energy, for manufacturing, and so on. But in this presentation, I'm mainly concerned with water for agriculture, for growing food, and water for domestic purposes. And I'll mainly be talking about research in African countries, but the project I work on is across a number of different countries. Okay, so I think it's worth saying, I'm sure you're all quite familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations goals for achieving sustainable development and eradicating poverty. And in those goals, we have Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is clean water and sanitation. But water dynamics and water for agriculture and for growing food also underlie many of the other goals. For example, you can't have zero hunger if you can't grow enough food. Gender equality is it's quite necessary to get to grips with the amount of time and effort that women particularly put into fetching and carrying water. And increasingly, managing water sustainably is being thought of as really necessary for climate action and for climate warming mitigation and so on. So really water, it sort of runs through, I mean, if you thought of kind of international policy making initiatives, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are a really good example, and water is necessary to meet many of these goals. Okay, so I think it's worth saying that over the years, there's this idea that it's often bandied about, the idea that there's a world crisis. And when people think of that, they tend to think of a shortage of water, droughts and water running out. In South Africa, in Cape Town, for example, in California, the agricultural water's running out and so on. But there's also a very strong idea running through policymaking circles that the world water crisis, if there is a world water crisis, can be solved by good governance, that it's a crisis of governance, that we just need to manage water better. We need to understand water flows better. We need to distribute it better. We need better forms of organisation for managing it and sharing it. Okay, so there's a very strong emphasis in policy making about water on governance. And you'd think that in some ways that we might have got this sorted by now, because this is not a new interest. In fact, an interest in water governance has been very strong since the 1980s and 1990s. There was a whole host of international conferences about water, some of them about drinking water, some of them about water as a natural resource, and so on. And during this time in the 1980s and 90s, there was the development of what we call the global policy consensus on water and what good water governance is. Okay, and although that might seem really historic to many of you, and probably, you know, well before some of you were born, these principles developed in the global policy consensus in the 1980s and 90s still run through many policies today and many attempts at the global level to work out how we can get better water governance. So these policies include the idea of decentralisation. That's good, that governments aren't necessarily the best at running everyday water services or water resources, that you might need this done right at the local level, possibly by decentralised government, but also probably by local associations of water users, be they farmers or people using water for domestic purposes. There's a very strong idea in the global policy consensus that you should have community participation in decision making and management about water. And that's also very strongly linked to the idea that communities and users should take responsibility for their own water supplies. And I'd just like you to stop and think for a minute about that in terms of where we live in a developed country with water coming through the taps, and the fact that we don't participate in the decision making and management about water sort of resources. We are consumers and we just turn the tap on and we pay for that in various ways. So when we're talking about community participation, we're often talking about people in poorer communities in the world who don't necessarily have piped supplies but have communal sorts of supplies of water, and the encouragement to get them involved in how they're going to manage that, how they're going to share it, often in cases where governments might be weak or unable to provide that service. Very strongly in the global water consensus is the idea of water as an economic good, that water has an economic value, be it for food production, crop production, for industry, even an economic value in terms of keeping people healthy so they can be good workers and so on. And that was quite a change that came about in the 1980s and 90s, not just seeing water as a free good or something that everybody could access without restriction, but putting some kind of economic value on it. And there was also, along with these principles, a big focus on women's involvement in water and the recognition of women's role in managing water resources and water services. Okay, so we have a mainstream global policy consensus on what good water governance is, the need for good water governance and what good water governance is. And that's often about planning and management through integrated water resource management. It's often concerned with formalisation, setting up formal committees or structures or management boards for managing water in a river basin, for example, setting up rights to water. Many countries now, you have to apply for a right to use water from a river or from the ground. There's this idea that privatised companies can often govern water better than public bodies. So we often have, for urban areas, urban utilities. And again, the idea of community management, that the community could be there right at the user level, managing some of the finer points of how water's shared and paid for and maintained. Okay, So those of us working in water from a sort of critical academic point of view think that's all well and good, but it hasn't really delivered the results so far. We've still got a problem with water. Millions of people in the world still go without water or without access to irrigation water for growing crops, suffer drought, don't really have enough for hygienic purposes, and so on. And so this kind of consensus has performed, if you like, the policies have performed very patchily. They don't always perform as planned, and we haven't met the SDGs that relate to water. So what other things do we need to think about to understand what's going on in terms of water relations and how people actually relate to water? And in this, I'm thinking about what I call everyday water governance. How do people's relationships, where they relate with each other and the water itself, shape access and the ways in which we manage water? And I won't dwell on that now because that's what I'm going to talk about as we go on through the presentation. But the picture on the bottom right just shows these, the woman in the middle is a treasurer of a water point committee, and with the other women who are collecting water there at a borehole, she's actually negotiating who shall pay their maintenance fees there. So we're looking at that level. So rather than looking at this global level of policy for good governance, we're thinking, how does this work out at the very local level? Okay. And when we're thinking about that in more recent times, the whole idea of water justice has come up. Like, water's not just a managerial task to be done. It's not just something we can solve technically or managerially. We need to think about things like fairness and equity, that how people get fair shares within and across populations. So this justice approach has very much come up as something to criticise, if you like, some of the global policies on water. And along with the water justice, again, the very much strong focus on community-based management, which in the global governance model is often quite a formalised version of community management set up through associations and committees, and designed to ensure that these people at community level take responsibility for their water supply. But I want to take a look at water a little differently, and community-based management a little differently to that. Okay, so that's the sort of generalised ideas about water governance. But now I want to move on to draw some examples from research projects that we've been working on for the last 2 or 3 years, somewhat hampered by COVID. But this is a project called Transformations to Groundwater Sustainability. And what we're looking at, although we know there's a lot of problems with water governance and a lot of cases where it doesn't work out very well and people still have problems accessing water. But in our project, we're looking at cases from around the world where there are promising signs of people, mostly farmers, we're mostly looking at irrigation water, managing and sharing their water resources. And we're trying to work out what is it that makes it possible for people to cooperate, share and manage their water resources in situations where there's a lot of pressure on that resource. Okay, so we're looking at groundwater, and again, in international policy circles, groundwater is very much thought of as something very hopeful and promising for the future. So groundwater, I'll come on to in a minute, is water that's stored or arises from the ground in the rocks and the soil and the aquifers. And as rainfall gets more unreliable as we have a changing climate, there's a lot of faith being put in groundwater and tapping into groundwater to grow food, to feed growing urban populations, and because it's more climate resilient than surface and rainfall water. Okay. But there's a number of problems with thinking about groundwater. Because it's underground, it's invisible, so studying it or understanding it can be tricky. And also you need technology to drill down into the rock or the soil, or to dig down to access the water. And that can give rise to questions of being able to exclude people from it. So what I want to think about now, and what we do for some in investigating our projects, is think about people's own knowledges and technologies, and the ways in which people at local level, farmers or people using water for domestic use, what kind of knowledge they have about that water, and the infrastructure and the technologies they use to gather it. And the first thing to understand is that people are very adaptive. You can see on the left a young farmer in North Africa who's just adapted his motorbike engine to pump water out of the river to water his fields. And on the right of the picture, you can see a traditional well to which people have attached individual hoses and pumps to individually pump out of this collective well their water. So we know that people are very adaptive in trying to access water and to use technologies to do that. Okay, but as I've mentioned, one of the issues about water, and particularly groundwater, is how do people understand it and imagine it when it's under the ground? So one thing about groundwater is a lot of the groundwater exists in fractured rock. It's like the water fills the spaces between the rocks and travels between them, or in the soil, the sort of gravelly soil fills the spaces between there. And so it's not really like an underground lake or something like that. It's more something you've got to drill into the rock and the soil in order to access it. But people understand that differently because they can't necessarily see it. And many people understand groundwater as an underground flowing river or a lake or something similar. And therefore they have sometimes unrealistic ideas about how far it can be replenished, or what the nature of that water is. This is another sort of diagram showing you groundwater more appearing like an underground pool or lake, which it does in some cases be held in these sort of underground storage aquifers. And this also shows you that people have to drill down to different depths to access water, or to dig down to shallow depths to access water. So somehow farmers or people who want to use water have to know about the different levels of soil and rock. They have to know which kind of water source is going to produce a quantity of water and so on. And this is something that we're trying to match up with technical knowledge about water, like people, for example, who've been used to living in the desert for a long time have quite a knowledge about where the water is in the desert, where the groundwater is, at what times they can use it, how much they can take of it, and so on. And they've lived with that for years and years and years. And so we're trying to value that kind of knowledge alongside the technical knowledge that comes from hydrogeology. Okay. So one of the problems about groundwater, as I said, it's underground, and some of the technology might be underground. So on the left-hand side, there's a diagram of a hand pump pumping up water, but you'll see that some of the pipes and casings and the pumping mechanism is also below ground. And that gives communities quite a problem in how to manage that. How do you manage the below the ground bits? On the right-hand side of the picture, you can see a case in Zimbabwe where people have constructed a sort of scaffold there so that they can pull the pipes out from deep down underground if they need to do maintenance. So we're talking about community management, and when we talk about community management in the global policy consensus, it's often about committees and structures, committees and constitutions and tariffs and formal organisational ways of managing water. But here we see two girls pumping a borehole, and they're pumping the groundwater up from down below to use for drinking water. Okay, so we rarely see girls as thought of as water managers, but here they are pumping the water. And what they're doing in this case, if I had been able to show you the video, is they're listening to the sound that the pump makes when they're pumping. And from the sound, they can tell how much water is left down in the borehole, how much groundwater is left, whether it's been pumped dry and they need to wait to recharge it or not. And they can tell this from having lived with it for a long time, from how heavy it is to pump, from the sound of it. So quite a lot of people's knowledge and community management is around people's actual use of the water. They know and they manage and they learn about it through using it and through using the technology. And in this case, these girls identified that the pump wasn't sounding right. It was making a particular noise that it makes when there's a problem, and when there's it's pumping dry and it's not pumping up properly, and maybe the valves are broken or something like that. And then they tell their parents, and this team of men comes along, probably with a couple of technicians there, pulls out the pipes from underground, investigates what's going on and mends it. So this sort of community management doesn't really appear very often in the model of the global policy consensus, but it's very much about how people go about managing their water sources. Okay. And here again, we see a range of sort of management practices and beliefs. On the right-hand side is a constitution of a water point committee, and it's written out on a child's exercise book, and it's a community making up their own rules about who can use the pump and when they can use it and what they can pay for, what they should pay for it, and so on. So it's a combination of official, but it's also adapted to local circumstances. Management practice is very much based on people's everyday lives and beliefs as well. So the man in the middle, he's the chairman of a water point committee, and he tries to organise the community to share the water, maintain the pump, pay for repairs and so on. He's also the traditional healer of the area. He's holding his certificate as a traditional healer, and he uses his authority as a traditional healer to also persuade people to manage the water properly and so on. So these sort of overlapping elements of life, it's not just as neat as running a committee, it's using different social roles, sources of authority, and cultural practices really to manage water. Okay, and moving on to that, we've got another nice case here of maintaining a water supply in Zimbabwe. So this is where groundwater is pumped up from underground into an overground tank to store water, which is then pumped down irrigation canals so people can grow crops in a dry part of Zimbabwe. So when the water's pumped up from underground water doesn't have algae because there's no light. When the water is stored in this tank and it comes into contact with light, it grows algae. And if the water with a lot of algae is let out through the pipes and the irrigation canals, it will clog everything up and the water system won't flow. So here we see a man, and there's many other, cleaning the tank of algae at some point. And you think this is quite a technical management issue. But in fact, here, these people cleaning this tank are very careful about cleaning the algae, because they don't think the algae are just some natural phenomena. They think the algae are sent to them by the spirits, the ancestral spirits of the land, to warn the farmers that their farming practices are unsustainable. So the algae are something about the spirit, the realm of the spirits, and people's worldview beliefs about ancestors and the spirit world and so on. So they're managing this, not just because it's a technical issue, but also because it's an issue of their ancestral spirits telling them, warning them about their behaviour and how to adapt their farming practices. And I think this is something that gets left out when we talk about global governance, global policy models, good governance, ideas about what is good governance, that people's actual worldviews and beliefs and ways of understanding technical processes are often left out of the picture, and yet they're actually very important to people's lives and how they actually do things. Okay, and then I also want to talk about a little bit about inequalities, because what we see is we see a lot of cases of people managing their own water supplies, trying to keep them going, understanding them in various ways, whether it's through bodily pumping, listening to them, seeing what grows around the borehole, understanding when the underground water gets recharged, and so on. So people do have quite strong ideas about how to manage their water. And they also have ideas about how to organise themselves collectively to do so, queuing systems, tariff systems, sharing systems, taking turns with irrigation water, and so on. However, if we think about the idea to think about water justice, these community-based forms of arrangement aren't necessarily about equality or making sure that everyone gets the same water. Some people, for example, can afford to have a pump or a tap put in at their own house, or a well for irrigation in their own field, and so on, and they're able to take much more water than everybody else. Now, obviously, if they can do that, because groundwater is a common pool resource, it means if they're taking more water, they're depleting the water supply for other people. So where you have individual usage of water, as well as public or collective usage of water, there's often a tension between that and a difficulty in managing that or making that more equitable. Oops. So one question I'd like to think about when we think about governance and water governance in particular is who does it, who has the power to shape these arrangements, to decide who gets how much water, and in whose interests are they acting. And as I've mentioned before, for example, we rarely think of children as water managers. Women often have to wait a long time for men to use water for irrigation or for livestock watering before they can take water for drinking. And so there's a number of sort of unequal relationships built into community-based water governance that we need to be aware of, because those kind of inequalities can impede people getting access to water. Okay, it seems I've left off my last slide by when we were muddling around a bit with the technical problems. So I just want to, so what I hope I've just tried to convey is, whilst we have these global level policies and general agreement about how to manage water, this isn't necessarily very helpful to understanding what goes on at local level or how local people understand water governance. And another question I'd like to raise to conclude with is when we think about sustainability. So in the global consensus on water now and the sustainable development goals and so on, obviously we're supposed to be balancing economic development and poverty alleviation with the idea of being environmentally sustainable. And I think the question is that how can that be enacted at local level, where people, I mean, these people are taking water for drinking and washing and so on, so they're probably using quite small amounts of water. But if they were pumping out a borehole with a diesel pump for irrigation purposes, they could be taking an awful lot of water out of the ground for irrigation, and irrigated crops will probably earn a lot of money and contribute to economic development, but will be depleting the resource base in some way. So I think water governance is a really good example of how there is this constant tension, if you like, between economic development and environmental sustainability. So we haven't found the answers in our project yet, but we're trying very hard to understand the different ways in which local people are able to manage and sustain their water resources. So for anyone who's interested, have a look at the Transformations to Groundwater Sustainability website, because we've got a lot of narrative case reports and photographs and blogs and videos and things there, which give you a flavour of the challenges in different countries in the world of achieving sustainable water governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frances. And thank you very much, because you've done that straight after our technical difficulties, and you've done it really, really calmly, and it's just come across so nicely. I know you're time limited now, but I just had a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to check, will it be okay to put out with an email I send out to our regular audience, your email address, so that if anybody had any particular questions to ask you, they could email you that?
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. And I suppose I just wanted to ask a general question, which was, you answered one of my questions, which I was wondering what kind of methodologies you used within your research, and that idea of the narrative case study. So people on the ground interacting with local people, observing what they do, talking to them about what they do. Are there any other particular methods that you'd like to highlight as being interesting?
Yeah, so some of them, some of the work we've done, I mean, it's very clear on the project website, is done in collaboration with local people. So our project's not just done by researchers, we've also got sort of advocacy groups and people, NGOs who work on technical issues of hydrology, but also on social and economic transformation. So they are often working with communities to actually solve a problem or do participatory groundwater governance. So that kind of participatory methodology is very much something that we kind of favour. Other people have used kind of arts-based approaches with community members, and we're experimenting with the use of drawings and some short videos and things like that. So not just going to interview people, because when you're trying to understand the meaning of things to people and people's underlying understandings of flows and forces and things like that, it's often not so amenable to interview. It comes out more in stories or pictures or other sorts of representation.
Brilliant. That's a really interesting answer, and exactly the kind of answer I hoped you might give me, because I know that students planning their NEAs need a lot of different ideas, and that sort of more imaginative approach to data collection and very qualitative data collection and very sensory data collection in some ways. I was very taken by that idea of the girls actually listening to the water and really understanding that feeling, you know, the listening and the feeling of the pump.
And that even applies as well for much more, much more high-tech things. Like we have irrigation schemes where the farmers are listening to the sound of the diesel pumps pumping overnight, and from the sound that the diesel pumps can make, they know how much water is left to pump and so on. So it's something I think that we've probably lost touch with a bit, because the water comes out the tap. But people who are living much more closely with the actual natural resource use their bodies to understand it as well. We have a lot of examples of I didn't have time to talk about here, but how do people know where to dig their wells or drill boreholes? And so we've got a number of examples of how people are divining water, or how they dig through the soil layers, and how they know which layer is which and which is likely to produce water, and so on. So this very sort of embodied form of management, I think, is something we don't pay enough attention to usually.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's not looked on by those people who perhaps have power in the world at the moment as very important, because it's not monetarized. And yeah, how interesting. It sounds like there's so much more to come out of this research. I'm looking at the time and thinking you probably need to go, so I'm not going to ask my other question.
Oh no, well that's fine. You can ask it if you like. I'll.
No, I was just going to say, could you point us on the Transformations website? I wondered if there was one case study there which was a really optimistic case study, where you thought there were a lot of really good examples within it of how we can manage groundwater really well.
So there is, absolutely. I can answer that really quickly. And it's a case of Randulabad in India. And if you look up that, there's some lovely information about how it's possible, how over the last 20 years they've worked together to manage their groundwater. And it's really a hopeful case. So
fabulous.
And if you look on the website, there's the narrative reports, there's photo stories, there's quite a lot of material. But if anybody wants any more, then do get in touch with me, and I can facilitate that.
That's fantastic, Frances. I think it's really important in the world, which is sometimes quite dark out there, to end on something really upbeat, and to give people an idea of something they can look at, which gives us hope for a more cooperative and collaborative future. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Thank you for this evening.
Okay, and thanks for bearing with the technical problems.
Not at all. It's one of those things. Thank you. Okay, thanks.
All right.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. And don't forget to join us on the 3rd of February. Just checking that date so I didn't get that wrong, when Alison Stenning will be telling us about Play in the City. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye.